This first little section of these supplementary recordings are just going to be some follow-up discussion of the material from the first lecture at OCON, Thinking Objectively. And I mostly want to have questions and discussions from the assembled group, including many luminaries, about these issues. There are 2 points, though, that I wanted to raise myself in advance, because reflecting on the lecture, I'm not sure how clear I was about them. They're really variants of the same point. The point that we need to keep metadata on all of the things we believe or think, and the issue of doing a sniff test or preliminary test as one goes about one's day-to-day life on those. The latter can seem very arduous, like one will never get time to do everything if one's checking up on every one of one's beliefs. And whether it seems too arduous to do or not, there's a question of what are you checking when you're checking up on them? What is it that you want to know that you have? And so I just want to, I think I said this in the talk, but I want to underscore it, that the 2 pieces of metadata, the 2 pieces of knowledge you want to have about the different things you believe or propositions you have in your head and you're not committed to whether you believe them, is what we might call their provenance and their status, where they came from and what you regard them as. Do you regard them as knowledge? Are you certain of them? Is it something that's probable? Is it something that you think is possible? It's worth considering, but you don't, think it's more likely than not? Or is it something you regard as arbitrary, something you've heard but with no evidence for it? Or is it something that you're not sure where in that hierarchy you would put it if you took the time to think about how much evidence you have for it, because you haven't done that work yet. Nonetheless, you have it there. You read it somewhere, some reasons were given, but you haven't thought about those reasons. So certain, probable, possible, arbitrary, or unprocessed are the statuses I have in mind. And by the provenance, where it came from. You thought of it yourself as a conclusion from a certain argument. You read it somewhere. You heard it somewhere. You've heard it a bunch of places. And with respect to the provenance, this can be more general or more specific. I've heard it somewhere. I read it in a newspaper is more specific than I have no idea why I've got this content, where this came from. But it's less specific than it was in the July 14th issue of the New York Times on page 8 below the fold, right? So the more specific, the better if you want to go check on it. But it's not a problem if you know something is something I just heard somewhere, so long as you know that it's something I just heard somewhere and you're treating it accordingly. I read it in an encyclopedia once. It's common knowledge, or it's rumored to be the case that. These are all fine. They're fairly general views of where the knowledge came from or where the idea came from. But there's nothing wrong with them. And when you're doing the sniff test, as I called it, or the preliminary check on a putative piece of knowledge, it's something I think one wants to do every time one notices oneself relying on a piece of knowledge, which is quite often. And that's why it's important that it's a very, very lightweight task. It's not even, once you get into the habit of doing it, a distinct separate step. It's just like the feeling of the weight in your keys as you walk out the door, the sniffing of the milk as you go to pour it. It's just, do I know why I think this, and how sure am I of it? And you're just checking whether you know those things. And if you do that check and get into the habit of doing that, I think you develop a kind of sensitivity when it's glaring to you when you're relying on something that you don't know why you think it. And then you will set aside some time later to do the thinking through. Or not. Just say, well, it would take some work to think this through. I don't have time to do that work. I don't want to do that work, but then I won't rely on this in the interim. And I don't think that's a very arduous thing to do 1,000,000 times a day. It takes, just the tiniest amount of developing a cognizance in yourself of how you're holding the different content you're holding. So I think you can really literally do it for everything. It is a bit time-consuming at first, but it gets pretty much second nature. Alan Godhelf and I used to talk about having a little epistemologist running in the background. Like on Windows, I assume there's a equivalent in Mac. You have these programs that run in the background and you can see them in your system tray and right-click on them and see what they're doing. Virus scanners work like this. You want to develop a little epistemologist down there, just checking on what you're saying. And it's a lightweight kind of activity. Now, if you are going to be an epistemologist, you might want to make it even more sensitive to different issues. But for just the purpose of ordinary knowing, why do I think this? Where did I get this from? And how sure can I be of it? Okay, so those are the two setup points I wanted to make. Let me just add one third, which is a variant of these two, and then open it up to discussion. In this talk, I talked about doing this with premises. The other thing that one wants to be careful of it with is words, individual concepts. Noticing when one's using and adopting in particular new words, words that one's heard and picked up around a certain field. And again, asking yourself, well, where did this word come from? Where did this bit of jargon come from? It's not something I knew when I was 6. When did I learn it? How did I learn it? And how sure am I that this is a valid concept? That this is a word that adds something rather than adding confusion to my vocabulary? I think it's particularly important to do it with words, with concepts, particularly as you're learning a new field, say in graduate school or in college in a course on something, and also in politics where a lot of these are thrown around. And it's part of being honest about one's cognition, because I think particularly with the use of words and also with the reliance on premises, if one makes oneself sensitive to where things are coming from, you'll find that there's a lot of things that you pick up that they're in the air in a certain area, around your department at school, at work, in a certain community. These ways of speaking, these relying on these premises are just in the air. Everyone's doing it. And there's a kind of, being one of the cool kids or seeming smart aspect to using them. You kind of imbibe them, particularly in a group that you want to become a part of. Maybe for good reasons, because you admire the people and you have good reasons for admiring them. Nevertheless, there's a kind of aping or parroting their ways of speaking, their ways of thinking. There's a sense in which I don't think that's bad. Calling it aping and parroting makes it seem bad. But having that content, those words, these ways other people think and other people reason and other people speak in your head is a good thing. In the same way that downloading all of Wikipedia would be a good thing into your head and having it there. So long as you're not doing it in propria persona. So long as it's other people's voices in your head using these words. When it starts to become your voice, and this becomes your way of speaking and your way of thinking, that's when you've got to know that it's the right way of speaking or thinking. That's when it transitions from being accumulated opinions of others that you've got to your beliefs. You can think about this even in normal ways of speaking, where you'll say in the vernacular such and such, or you'll use some hip-hop bit of jargon or some jive talk kind of humorously in somebody else's voice in your head. But there's when it becomes your way of speaking, and that's, I think, a difference that we notice with slang. One should notice it also with jargon, with political concepts, with, say, social justice, for example. This is a consideration of social justice. You have a sense of when people would say that. But, well, what exactly does it mean? You need to know that before you use it. So those are my preliminary addenda points. Now, just open things to general discussion. Thoughts, questions?
I have kind of a general question. I don't know if this was intentional or unintentional, but it came off a little bit warning us against what we don't know that we might think we know. Mm-hmm. And I was curious what you think that we do know. When, for example, I can give you an example that may be interesting or not, but like the first time I read the Comper-Chicos at age 27, that was the first I'd ever heard of any of the theory of progressive education. I got it all from Ayn Rand. I didn't have any other source for that except I had been through progressive education, and in connecting it to, it was a lightning strike. That's the thing that convinced me about objectivism, because it explained my entire educational system and the things that had bothered me about it. So I do think I had knowledge as a result of reading that one thing. But I do think, I may not have known exactly what progressive education was, but I think that I had, say, a first level understanding that progressive education harms children's minds. And I do think there are levels of understanding. And I had that first grasp, and I don't know how that fits with the things that you were warning us against. So
I want to differentiate a few different things.
Yeah.
There's what you could know if all you did is read that article. And that excludes not only reading other stuff, but doing any difficult intellectual work while you were reading the article. So you just read and, say, memorized the words of it. Obviously, you did a lot more than that if you were having all these connections and this thunderbolt moment. If you just read it and all you got is, she says this stuff, kind of not very focused, and you got these words in your head, well, then you wouldn't know anything. Now, what we're talking about, though, is a state where you've done quite a bit more than that.
Well, but in the course of
reading it. Yeah.
Right? It happened 1 2-hour period or whatever.
So we want to think about what you could have been doing while you were reading it that enabled these connections.
Right.
Then we want to think about what you might have had to have done after that to either secure that knowledge, if it was knowledge, or elevate it to the level of knowledge. Things that you could have done without reading anything else. Because I think there's quite a lot you could do just based on content you already had, but that's intellectual work. And then other kinds of work you would need to do that might involve further research, that you'd need to know further things. So, for example, if you'd never heard the concept progressive education before, I don't think you could know as a result of reading the Comparchicos that there's a movement, progressive education, that has these features that came into the American school system around a certain time and that crippled everybody's minds and that I'm a victim of it. Because that requires connecting it with, there are such things as educational movement. Maybe she got the name of it, maybe she's right about everything else, but got the history of the thing wrong. You just don't, that's something you'd need to be able to connect with some other content to know. You could know that the particular methods that she discusses in the article are used in at least some schools because they were used in yours, that they were used in your particular schools, that they, whether you can know this or have high probability on it is something we'd need to look at the claims in more detail to think about, but that they had effects on you and some of your students like the ones that she's describing. And then if you bring in the context of what you already know about how typical or unusual your education was, then you can start to generalize about whether this is typical of American education. So if you know that you went to a public school in a middle-class neighborhood and you have reason to believe that public schools don't vary hugely in similar neighborhoods around the country, and over the course of your adult life you've talked to people who went to other schools and you have good reason to think that they had roughly similar curricular to yours because you have a lot of the same concrete memories and you talk about things like that, then you're in a position to start saying, well, it's not just my school that happens to be like she described. And that might not be a distinct mental step because you might hold your education as typical and have good reason for holding your education as typical, right? That is your knowledge about how you were educated. Now, to do this in more detail than we just said, we'd have to look at the particular points made in the Comparchicos, and we have to do a more detailed processing than we could do other than by having like a little seminar together on the Comparchicos and thinking about what we each know going into it. But that's the kind of thinking you'd have to be doing on the plane, and that you could be doing pretty quickly in some cases, to be, in a non-illusory way, seeing this as really shedding a lot of light and connecting things. Then, after getting off the plane, I think, or later on, after putting down the article, one of the things you have to think about is, well, this is an interesting way that seems to shed a lot of light on my education and other things that I've noticed about how people think, and maybe it concretizes other concepts that I already held but were a bit floating for me, and I had reasons for them, but I couldn't quite see them in the real world. Like maybe you knew some things about I don't know what you might have read prior to that, if you'd read any objectivism prior to that.
I read basically everything.
Okay.
It was sort of the last of the anthologies I read.
All right. So if that's the case, then you have a whole lot of content that had whatever status it had up to that point. Some of it might have been certain, some of it might have been possible, some of it might have been probable. That was kind of integrations at the weighting that there were things missing from, and this helped you fill in those gaps, and you were thinking of good examples of things, and then when you saw the example, if all the connections were ready-made, quite a lot of electricity could run through them in that moment. But what I think you'd have to do after the fact is think, does this hold up to repeated reflection? And then with regard to any specific claims like progressive education is the culprit, what is progressive education? Where did that concept come from? Are there other schools of education? What do I know about progressive education other than, are there different views of what it is and so forth? Without doing that, you might be able to say something's really wrong with education in America. But to be able to say it's progressive education, which is a descendant of pragmatism and so forth, you'd need to have more content on the history of education, I think. Oh, one other thing I do want to say with this. I would be skeptical in the particular example you gave about how the progressive education affected your sister versus how the other education affected you. I don't know the exact details of it, but I would be skeptical that causal content would have been knowledge for you at that point, as opposed to probability, a very reasonable hypothesis. If what you're noticing is that your sister has these intellectual habits or profile of abilities, and you have these other ones, and you went to different schools, and you can kind of see how the one school might have. I think it would take quite a bit to be certain that caused it in your sister.
Oh,
but
it's much more concrete than
okay.
that. I mean, I don't know if it's interesting. I can tell you what it is. And they hadn't had her memorize the multiplication tables.
Uh-huh.
And so in 5th grade, she was behind. She was 2 years behind the kids in Maine when we moved to Maine.
I see.
And she caught up. In 6 months, she caught up because she's smart.
Right.
But it was pretty traumatic for her. And so it was really clear that the Sanford, Maine school system was way better than the Brooklyn, Massachusetts school system. And the Brooklyn, Massachusetts school system was well known to be progressive.
Well, all right, so there, I was thinking it was going to be something like, my sister has a mild tendency to floating abstractions. Or, if it was something like that, I don't think you could do the puzzle. Now, if it's something like this, where she doesn't know the times tables and I learn them, that I think you can tell pretty easily is the cause of the school. But then I don't think it's obvious, which it can be obvious which is better. There's reason to think it is, but, if I put you into a madrasa, at age 14, and all the other kids have been reading Arabic since they were 2, and you don't know the 150 name for God or however much they have. You might think, well, the madrasa is much better. These kids know more than I do. Now, that's a very prejudicial example because one doesn't need to know that stuff at all. But to know that the school where you get the multiplication tables memorized early is better than the one where you don't, I think you'd have to look at the final product, not the people in situ, because there might be situations in which there are legitimate options as to the order in which things are learned, or it's better to learn certain things later. Nonetheless, if you find the person, there's a developmental stage where one group will look more informed than the other. So, for example, think about Lisa Van Dam and Dave Harriman and Laporte. There's a lot of discussion among these schools run by objectivists about the importance of teaching science in a certain order and of not teaching very abstract and difficult to discover content early. So that, for example, you might not learn about the cell organelles as early if you went to these schools as you would if you went to a regular American public school. Or you might not learn about positive and negative charge in electricity until a little later, but you'd know a lot more about how to identify objects out in the wild. Now, if you take a child who's transferring from the Laporte school or from Lisa's Van Dam Academy to the public school, I'm sure you'll be able to find situations where the kid goes into a class where everyone else has memorized all the cell organelles, and he's got to take a lot of work to catch up. And if all you have is, when my sister got to the new school, she couldn't do some math problems that the kids there could, and I think you'd need more than just that. And you might have had more than just that. Ben?
Okay, so this question actually picks up quite well with what we were just discussing, what you're just discussing. It's a question about concept of knowledge. And I think that somebody listening to your first lecture for the first time is going to think you have very high standards for what it takes for something to be knowledge. Knowledge, you say, is not just memory. It's something you have to keep working on, developing over the course of your life. It's more something you do rather than something you have, etc. And I guess a question that somebody could ask is, well, why is that? Why are your standards for what knowledge is so high? Why isn't it enough, for example, that you be able to remember some fact that you learned in school? Why isn't it enough that you can, do a few things with it, like an equation in science? F equals MA. Memorize the equation, you can solve some, problems with it. Why, and in fact, it seems like sometimes we do legitimately call these sorts of things knowledge for, let's say, animals. We say dogs know their master. We say they know how to pick up the paper and bring it to us. Mm-hmm. So why is and I think I'm with you on this. I just think people would be curious to hear why you have such high standards for knowledge and why you think that's an important part of that concept.
Well, I think we really need to distinguish the last bit, the dogs know their master and they can recognize the master. I think that is the case in dogs and the case for similar things in human beings.
Okay.
I know all the people in this room and I could recognize you. But that's not just memory. It's an ability to recognize the thing again, to pick it out from the context. It has to do with a tracking of the things over time. So if I didn't see you for 30 years and I saw you again, I might not know you anymore because you'd look different, or I might. So I think that's not an example where I would disagree with the people. The kinds of examples are if you're taught E equals MC squared in school as a great discovery of Einstein's, and now you think you know that, but you have no idea what it means. If you just have words that you've remembered, the words of a theory, that's the thing that I want to say isn't knowledge. Even the F equals MA example, you can do certain operations with it. And I think there is knowledge of some things involved in that, how to do certain equations. But if all you have is the knowledge of how to do certain equations, that's not yet knowledge about the physical world. What if you don't, for example, know what mass is, but you could do those equations. You don't know what acceleration is, but you just know to put A equals whatever after you've done the equation. Now, why do I say it's not knowledge? Well, there's a positive way to put it, but let me put it in a negative way first. Go back to the madrasa student who's learned all this content about Allah and about the history through that perspective and about what will happen, and has learned ways of interpreting events through that window. Or, take the more homegrown people who, when there are hurricanes, think it's because of gay people and so forth, because they've learned, God punishes us because we allow gay marriage, and so that's why we have hurricanes. Right? This kind of way of thinking, where there's a system not just of stuff that they've remembered, but also built-in ways of interpreting events that come out of that system. There are operations that they could perform on it. If we take it that those people don't have knowledge, and I think they don't, if your set of abilities is only accidentally different from theirs, different only in what you happened to be taught from them. If you had gone to that school instead of the one you did, instead of running through the set of operations with F equals MA, you would run through the set of operations with God's hatred of gays and God's control over the weather, and come up with what these preachers come up with, then if the preachers don't have knowledge, I think you don't have knowledge. And I think you don't. But even the way we've been talking about it, I think, is too much from a third person's perspective. This third party, the epistemologist, sees that you believe something true, and sees that the brainwashed madrasa student believes something false. And then he thinks that he shouldn't credit you with knowing the true thing because you're functioning like the madrasa student, and it's just an accident that you're saying the things you are rather than the nonsense that he sprouts. There's something to this, but really the question, is it knowledge or not, is much more pressing and much more important in one's own case, when one is asking it about something that one has found oneself assuming. So look at it from your own perspective, from the perspective of someone who wants to know, wants to get things right, wants to really be aware of the world, and isn't sure how to do it, and when he has done it, when he is aware, when he's right. Why aren't you sure? Why wouldn't such a person be sure? Well, you know that people often get things wrong, very wrong. We're not talking here about the fact that they sometimes mistake one person for another, or that they sometimes make an error in calculation and adding up a column of figures. Rather, if we're talking about things like scientific theories or philosophical or religious views or why the weather is what it is or morally evaluating people or making good investment decisions and so on, then you know that people are wrong not occasionally but all the time by default. All of these fields and issues are rife with controversy, and there are God knows how many contrary views on each issue. And since these views are contrary, at most one of them with respect to any issue can be true. So once you've noticed that, how can you with any confidence go on regarding what you've thought heretofore on any issue as true as knowledge as the way the world actually is, if you can't say what makes this view and your holding of it different from all the contrary people with their contrary views? Now, if you first notice this in the context of some specific debate about some specific issue, of course you can start off by trying to articulate why your position on that issue is better than the alternatives. And if you come up blank, you can start by thinking about whether you can find anything that makes any of the alternatives, whether the one you held before or some other one, better than the competing alternatives. And you can start thinking about whether with respect to the issue you can find anything about you or the way you're thinking or other people and the way they're thinking that makes them better, more or less likely to get it right than someone else. And of course it's good to do this in an issue-by-issue sort of way. But at some point, if you're doing this and being conscientious, you're going to be pushed to think in general about what a human being needs to do to get it right, to become aware, and to maintain an awareness of the facts. And once you're satisfied that you have an answer to that question, that is, to the main kind of question of epistemology, then you'll want to use that as a guide to your thinking on every issue, and as the way to judge whether you do have knowledge or not, and what you need to do to get it. So what I think I've given now is the reason why, in one's own case, the only case that really matters, one needs to be reflective in something like the ways I've discussed, in order to be able to rationally regard what one believes is knowledge. If we find in our own case that with respect to F equals ma, we have nothing we can say about why we think it, and about how we're sure of it, or we find that what little we can say leaves it still a mystery to us how we're any better off cognitively than the brainwashed madrasa student, then we have no business continuing to regard F equals ma as knowledge, as an awareness of reality. It's just something we've heard or something we find ourselves inclined to utter.
Well, let me ask this one follow-up. I suspect so a critic could sympathize with most of what you're saying there and still say, well, you've got your finger on an important phenomenon, but what you're talking about is not knowledge but understanding. And why can't we just say that everything you've just described, that's what it is to understand something, and people should try to understand things, and if they're not living up to their obligations. But we can still say that they know things that they don't understand, and we maybe will often, explain their behavior on the basis of what they know. Why did this person get the answer to this puzzle right? Well, because they knew that F equals ma. So why is this a criteria for knowledge? And
well, let's take that very kind of example.
Okay.
But I would want to draw a distinction between knowledge and understanding, where you can have knowledge without having what you might call understanding, something deeper, and that's still distinct from this type of belief that's floating and not that I don't think is knowledge at all. So take the difference between someone who's just heard some law of physics, and they read it in a textbook, and they know nothing more than that, and have thought nothing more than that, and they get the answer right on Jeopardy. But that's it. From, on the one hand, Newton, or a physicist, who we would say has understanding of it. And in between them, somebody who says something like, well, I don't really understand this. I know there are a lot of unanswered questions about this. But I've heard from these people who launched a rocket to the moon that this formula explains how they've done it. They've given me some indication of the method by which they've reached it, although I couldn't rederive it myself or totally explain it. They've given me some indication of how this claim played a central role in this momentous accomplishment. I know other people can't launch rockets to the moon. I certainly couldn't get one there. I have excellent evidence that they did get one there, despite some loonies who say otherwise. Even if it didn't get there, I saw it go up. I couldn't make that happen. So you can have reason to believe that it's true. That's quite compatible with saying there's a lot about this I don't know. I don't fully understand it. Now, we can think about, in each case, how much is required. Do we have that for E equals mc squared? Do we who are non-scientists and don't know much about physics, I know very little, have it about E equals mc squared? How much quantum phenomena do we have it about based on, there's some of the recent advances in computing and so forth? And that will vary from person to person based on what you've read and how much you've thought about it. But take that kind of a state versus, it was in the textbook, and then versus the physicist on the other hand. I think those are worlds apart. The person who thinks about it in connection to the moon landing is a critical, engaged thinker, sensitive to the fact that he could make errors, knows why he thinks what he does, wouldn't believe what he was taught in the madrasa if he were using that same method. He would think, well, what, these armies keep losing, and well, I don't know, Allah's not, there are hurricanes that affect pious people too. If you picture somebody doing the mental work we ascribe to this knowledgeable non-physicist with regard to the formulae of physics, doing it with regard to religious dogmas, we see that he'd come out quite different. It's not an accident of just where he happens to be that he believes F equals MA as opposed to the contrary. And he's sensitive to the defects that there might be in his understanding of that. Versus, again, the madrasa student or the Billy Graham, parroter or whoever.
Wouldn't a stronger answer to that be the positive case that you said you were going to, positive side of this, that you said you were going to give, but I think you neglected to give it?
Go ahead. Or you want me to
I assume it was that knowledge is a certain relationship actively established to the facts, and it requires certain means. Mm-hmm. It's a form of awareness, and just as you can't see something unless you're in the right position and the right lighting, mm-hmm. so you can't know something if you haven't established the causal conditions of attaining that contact with reality.
I think that's true, but then we could ask what those conditions are, and why isn't having been told by somebody who knows it, whether or not you know that person knows it, why isn't that one of the relevant conditions? The set of questions Ben's asking is coming out of, or playing the devil's advocate on behalf of, the externalist movement in contemporary epistemology. And that movement is saying, if you start building all this method-following stuff into the content of what it takes to know something, and knowing something becomes such a difficult thing that hardly anybody is going to know anything. And that can't be right. That's ridiculous to say that most people know very little. Therefore, what we have to do is give another account of how we know. What most of them do, then, is say that we know if we are properly causally connected to the facts, which I think there are elements that are right about that. But how much is it really saying to say that there has to be some causal connection or process relating you to the object in the world by which you know it? Isn't that just saying there has to be some cause of your knowing and not telling you what it is? If you give that kind of an account, you then need to flesh it out by saying what the process is. And the line of questioning Ben was raising comes from people who want to fill it out in a way that doesn't require self-conscious reflection and work on the part of the knower to be any part of the causal process by which he knows. These people think of knowing as something, in effect, that happens to you, rather than as something that you actively do. So I don't think the thing missing from the externalists that Ben was talking about is the causal element or the causal connection to the fact element. I think they have that in spades. What I think is missing is the element of why it has to be an active, self-directed, self-monitored, self-conscious, methodical process. Why it has to not just be a process of the objects affecting you, but of your methodically going out to find out about the object. It's that methodical element that is what objectivity is about. And so what I was trying to do in response to Ben's question is say why that is indispensable. There's another side to the issue raised by the epistemologists that Ben is channeling, by the externalists. We've been discussing very sophisticated knowledge, like the knowledge of the laws of physics. These are cases where it is easier and more common to reach the wrong conclusion than the right one. And in these cases, even some of the externalist epistemologists, though not all of them, would agree that an individual needs something like the sort of methodical self-consciousness that I've been calling for. And if we think about a scientist or even a good science student, it's not such a stretch to think that he is self-conscious in just these ways. But what I've been saying is that to have any knowledge, we need to know where we got it and how sure we are of it. So we might ask about less sophisticated pieces of knowledge, knowledge about the sorts of issues where mistakes are rare, knowledge about one's immediate surroundings, for example, or more general knowledge about the many facts of life that people in most cultures get right, facts like that we need to eat and about the various means of acquiring food. Surely even very unsophisticated people know these sorts of things. And is it really plausible to think that they're engaged in a lot of self-reflection, that they're busy asking, why do I think this, and how sure can I be of it? I won't say very much about that here except for a reference that I talk about that issue in my essay, Conceptualization and Justification, which is in Concepts and Their Role in Knowledge, the second volume of the Ayn Rand Society's Philosophical Studies book series. What I'll say now is that the work involved in identifying things in one's immediate surroundings is fairly simple. We learn it as babies. And although errors are possible there, they're not so pervasive because the method isn't so complex, the work isn't so complex, as what's involved in the sciences, in establishing the kinds of claims that are usually controversial among people. And I do think we have knowledge of how we're proceeding in these cases. It's just not as explicit and doesn't need to be as explicit for most people as it does in the more difficult cases of cognition.
Good, thank you.
Evan?
In your example earlier of the religious fundamentalist who has doesn't have knowledge about the premises he holds and then deduces in that framework consequences such as you said, blaming hurricanes for the sexual behavior of certain people. There's really
the other way around.
Oh, okay. My point, though, is that they're making two errors. One is their starting place is arbitrary and erroneous, but the second is that they're focused on deduction rather than integration. And the reason I mention that, because I think there are some objectivists who make that error. In other words, their premises will be correct. They say, well, people have volition, there shouldn't be coercion, and then they think that's all they need to know to reach very grand conclusions about economics or physics or other subjects that they've never really studied. And they'll hear an argument and in the context of what they know, they'll say, well, this is consistent with some axioms or core assumptions I think are true, therefore that argument is true. But it isn't, and they don't really have enough knowledge to know it's true. So it's a kind of error that even someone with correct premises can make. Not only people who are reaching all sorts of conclusions about the world because they're religious fundamentalists and making bad deductions, and inappropriately making deductions from that. People can have correct starting points and still be in error because of their deductive method, and if they're not asking the kind of questions that you were describing should be asked.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. The reason why I brought up why I handled Ben's question the way I did and brought in the operations that the non-physicist who knows the formula and has a little bit of math can perform, and also the deductive operations that the nut job evangelist performs, is that I wanted to show that it's not only a matter of what phrases of words you develop, but whole systems and habits of thought that can have this disconnected from reality feeling. But the objectivist that you describe, who says the words of good abstract principles, but doesn't know what he's doing with them, so to speak, may be like the non-physicist who just remembers the words of some formulae and then can apply them, but can do some derivations from them. So he's the very person that I was saying doesn't have knowledge by comparison to the religious fundamentalist. Now, having said that, let me add that one rationalistic deduction or two or five doesn't show that the content from which you're doing these deductions is totally floating and you're in the state of somebody who's just memorized the words of them. But if that's your characteristic way of behaving, I think we do have to question whether you really know these words are true. If you do really know that these words are true, that the F equals ma is true, or that force paralyzes the mind is true, or whatever principle it might be, the reasons are going to be the kind of thing that the guy who could just say F equals ma, or just parrot some lines out of OPAR, the activities that he's not doing. And if you are doing those, and you also find yourself sometimes engaging in these rationalistic deductions, the thing I think you need to do is to connect the mental work you're doing and applying it to the work you've done in building up the theory, and think about it in light of that. And we'll talk a little bit about that, a little more about that later, I think. In connection with the epistemic statuses of certain, probable, possible, and then arbitrary, let me just add a thought as to why just these four. There's the amount of evidence might be continuous, and you might be able to say 65.23% sure. And in some kinds of fields, you can do that because of the specific nature of the evidence. And you could have things like on the cusp between probable and certain and so forth. But the reason why I think there's an importance to these particular categories is that they present broad cutoffs that are necessary to use in your mental and existential action. Mental action inferring from the things, existential action taking actual actions based on them. Basically, what's certain is what you know, and you're not making any allowances for alternatives to it as you do it. What's arbitrary is something that you're not even considering as a specific thing that might be the case, because you have no reason to consider it. You might have a reason to consider a broader field of things in which it falls, but no reason to specifically consider it. So an example would be, I'll be struck by lightning tomorrow. I might have reason to consider the broader possibility that some ill will befall me in the next year and I should get insurance, but not any reason to make allowances for the specific issue of whether I get hit by lightning tomorrow. So these are things where I'm certain that I live in Hoboken, and it's arbitrary to suppose that I'm going to get hit by lightning tomorrow, and so I don't make allowances in my thinking for the alternative of maybe I don't really live in Hoboken, or maybe I will get hit by lightning tomorrow. Then there's the issue of where there's enough evidence to take a hypothesis seriously enough that as you're thinking about things, you're allowing for it. You're putting a certain amount of thought into in case this other alternative is true. There's a budgeting of resources, an act you're doing of keeping this other alternative alive in your thinking. That's what it means to regard something as possible. And I talk a little bit more about this and about why you can only regard so many different things as possible at once in my course, Objectivist Epistemology and Outline. But the essence of it is if you're regarding something as possible, you're doing the work to keep the case file open on this. And every time you draw a conclusion relevant to it, or plan an action relevant to it, you take a little bit of time to consider the implications of, in case it's true, this thing for it. That's what it means to regard it as possible. To regard it as probable is to have your default reasoning be that it's true. When you're thinking about what to do tomorrow, you think in terms of what's probably true. But since it's only probable, not certain, you're also having some contingency planning in your thinking in case it's not true. Probably Harry's going to come to the thing, and so I should do things on the premise that Harry's coming to the thing, but I shouldn't rely on it because he might not come. It's only probable that Harry's going to be here, and so I shouldn't buy an expensive cake that will go to waste if Harry doesn't come because only Harry likes it. So that's why those are special categories, and why I think any more complicated tracking of levels of things that you might be doing has to collapse into those four buckets a lot of the time, because you have to decide how to act, including how to act cognitively, what research projects in your mind to keep alive and to keep open.
I think that's very important that you package that up for us. The four cases.
Yeah. So for a proposition to be certain is for the evidence for it to be conclusive, for the evidence to be such that it's rational to regard the proposition as case closed true, and irrational to keep on entertaining alternatives to it. For a proposition to be probable is for the evidence to be such that it's rational to take the proposition as a premise in one's acting and reasoning, but it's only rational to take it as a premise so long as one's also making allowances for alternative possibilities, for the possibility that it's false. So it's not case closed true. You're still looking at alternative evidence and planning for those possibilities. For a proposition to be possible is for the evidence to warrant making allowances for it in one's thinking and acting, having contingency plans for it, and exploring it as a possibility, exploring further evidence, being on the lookout for evidence for it. For a proposition to be arbitrary is for there to be no evidence for it, such that it's irrational even to entertain it.
I'm curious about the issue of a need or obligation to seek out original information or explanations as part of, and how that relates to epistemic status. On certain issues, even in some of the examples you gave in the recording or today, you can see in your methodology, and I think it's good methodology, to actively consider alternative explanations, even if they're not sort of before you already, right? What might be another explanation for what went on in the education example of Jean with your sister, right? On the other hand, if one is sort of under a general obligation to do that and one's knowledge is heavily qualified, unless you do that, even when there might not be an alternative explanation, there's no evidence to believe that one is out there, isn't going and looking for one potentially arbitrary, right? And not, and therefore not a good use of intellectual resources. Is there a general proviso one has to have on a piece of knowledge or an epistemic status of a piece of knowledge if one doesn't go out and seek an alternative explanation or information, or is that more discipline or task or item specific?
Well, I think the issue of alternative explanations only comes up as such in a specific sort of case. It comes up when your reason for a certain hypothesis is that you think it's the only or maybe the best explanation for some phenomenon that you're trying to explain. And in order to make the judgment that it's the best or the only explanation, you need to give some thought to what category or categories of things are capable of causing the phenomenon in question. Now, in this case, giving thought to the category of things that are capable of causing the phenomenon doesn't mean considering any or every specific item within that category as a possible alternative explanation, going one by one through every thing in the category. It's arbitrary to seize on any specific one, even as a possibility, until you have some specific evidence for it. And the reason why you need to consider the category as a whole is to make sure that you haven't arbitrarily or with insufficient evidence seized on whichever explanation first occurred to you. So let's take an example. Suppose your boss requests a meeting with you, and it just occurs to you that maybe he's about to fire you. That's why he's he's called this meeting. In order to evaluate that explanation, you need to think in general about the sorts of reasons that a boss might have for meeting with an employee. And then once you've thought about what that range is, what the category is, you can think whether there's any specific evidence out of all of the items in that category to seize on the explanation that he wants to fire you. In most circumstances, it would be arbitrary to suppose either that he's there, he called the meeting to fire you, or else that he called the meeting for any other specific cause, like to promote you or to transfer you to Honduras or to invite you to his daughter's birthday party. So let's suppose we're in a situation like this where there just isn't any evidence in favor of any purpose the boss might have at this level of specificity. So you don't have any evidence, but you've leapt the idea that he might be calling the meeting to fire you leapt to mind because of some quirk of yours. You're an anxious person, or you've been having a bad day, and for whatever reason this leaps to mind. In this case, what you need to do is get cognitively back to the general set of things that could explain it, rather than thinking about this particular case. You don't need to start considering alternative hypotheses one by one, and again, considering them would be arbitrary. You might, however, think about some other thing, like maybe he's called the meeting to give you a raise, not because you're going to treat that really as an alternative hypothesis, but just as a way to help yourself see that your idea that he's called the meeting to fire you is just arbitrary. You've just seized on something in particular. So you ask yourself, is there any reason to think he called this meeting to fire me? No, I mean, for all I know, he could be calling it to promote me. So if you're reasoning like that, you're not really considering an alternative hypothesis as a possibility, not in the epistemic sense of possible we've been discussing. You're just using a very different arbitrary hypothesis as a sort of example to make clear to yourself the full range of purposes that the boss could have for asking for the meeting. And you're doing this so that you bring your mind back to the more general question, why did he call for this meeting? What kinds of reasons could he have for it? Rather than focusing arbitrarily on the specific one. And so the effect of this line of thinking is that you dismiss both speculations about the purpose as arbitrary, unless you found some evidence for one of them, rather than continuing to entertain them as possibilities. And as you walk up to the boss's office, running in your head through, well, what if he wants to fire me? Or what if he wants to promote me? What will I say? That would be regarding them as possible. Now, Jean's education case wasn't exactly an example of explaining something, at least not as I was understanding it. She was evaluating two schools, and as I understood her, she was using the premise that a school in which the students know their multiplication tables by a certain age is better than one in which they don't. So I just asked myself how sure I was of that premise. And immediately I thought, well, I don't know that much about why schools put their curriculum in a certain order and what makes that better or worse. And I started projecting, are there cases where it could be that one school would be better than the other, even though there were areas in which the student at the worst school knew more? And then I thought of examples. But the point of the examples wasn't to generate, some specific alternative theory on which progressive education was better or something. And I don't think it is better, but I just was trying to check that premise. And I found I don't think that a child at, say, 12 would be in a position to know for sure that a school at which the kids know their multiplication tables is better than one that they don't. So if it was the case that Jean formed that judgment at 12, when she didn't yet know anything about curriculum design, and if she hadn't thought about it since, it's something that she'd need to revisit before she could be certain on those grounds that one school was worse than the other. So again, I'm not saying that, she can't be certain now, but what we were doing in that bit of the conversation was thinking about all the work that would have to go into that knowledge. And Jean's someone who's thought a lot about education, so she probably has done, and, was a psychology graduate student, but she'd probably done quite a bit of this thinking beforehand and had it to hand. Now, I don't have a general principle here on how and when to project alternatives, but let me say one or two things that I did in this case. The one was that I thought, there are people who would defend progressive schools. So what would one of them probably say if he were here? And do I have the knowledge I'd need to judge whether his answer was good? That thinking about who the advocate of the other side is and what he would say, that devil's advocate in thought, is often a helpful heuristic for seeing how good your position is. And the second thing I did was just ask myself generally what I know about why schools build their curricula in different ways. And then that brought to mind examples of schools that I know of that seem to me to have good reason for teaching things in a very different order than the one in which they're most often taught. In any case, the general principle here behind my thinking isn't always try to generate counterexamples or alternative explanations, but rather for any premise that you notice is operative in your thinking, think about why you think that premise is true and how sure you can be that it's true. And first, just give it a quick look to see how sturdy it seems. And then, you might find the need to go into it in greater depth. And just doing it here with this premise, I found that entertaining some counterexamples or possible counterexamples was helpful. But it's not, always be on the lookout for counterexamples. They're useful in certain types of thinking, but they're not the main thing or the be-all and end-all. The main thing is think about your premises and think, how do I know that? Why do I think that?
I think there's a general issue I'm not completely clear about in the intent of the lecture, and it has to do with who are examples of what degree of meeting or not meeting the standard, how the range of measurements go in people's actual lives. Are you saying, for instance, only about 0.1% of the population really has knowledge about things beyond very close to the perceptual level? So that when most people talk about, the Mayans had a civilization here long before we do, they're just giving you magazine knowledge. And only a very few people who have read the books and judged the quality of the book and the reputation of the author really know that. Or are you saying, no, about 20% of the population have knowledge, but there's a large percentage of people I found in teaching and my students who pop off the things that they don't distinguish whether they know them or just heard them? Or are you saying this is rare? Most people, most of the time, have knowledge. Now, again, beyond there's a microphone on the table, or steak turns from rare to medium to well done with more cooking. But on the kinds of things that they're spouting off on, it's a small percentage of the population who doesn't have knowledge.
All right. So first, a chronological point, and then an answer. Use the term magazine knowledge for the stuff that's just stuff you've heard but you don't know. Part of me likes that term because it's a magazine. You got it from the magazine. Part of me doesn't because it's magazine knowledge, and I don't like calling it a type of knowledge, even though I know like a toy dog isn't a dog. So I called it. What I call it to myself is rumor. Stuff one's heard, but that has a little bit, maybe not the quite right connotation. Stuff that's in the air, whatever. Now, what status do people have? Well, so you gave two types of areas of cognition in which we could ask this. One is science, history, etc., things in which there are specialties. The other is the microphone on the table. There's a fair amount of cognition that's more abstract and requires more work than identifying the things in your immediate environment. That is a lot less work than really establishing with certainty the facts about the Mayans. the kinds of things that people know in connection with their jobs, and a mechanic's knowledge of how to fix a car, and knowledge about your friend's motivations and morals, things that can take quite a bit of work. So I think most people have quite a lot of knowledge about those sorts of things. And although they might not be very articulate about it, and might be in a kind of primitive state with regard to their epistemological acuity to the issues about it, and unable to articulate the reasons about it, with a little bit of work could articulate the reasons about it. Well, why do you think so-and-so is dishonest? Are you sure she was dishonest? Or just, is that a good reason? And they would have answers that are fairly forthcoming. It wouldn't be, if you were doing this kind of dialogue with somebody, a revelation that these questions could be asked. Maybe if you do a really good job of doing it, it would feel like a breath of fresh air. I didn't know you can do it this cleanly or crisply, or it might feel a little new or exciting to them, or else painful and difficult, but it wouldn't be totally out of the blue. I didn't have the sense you could ask these. I never thought about why I think she's dishonest or not at all. It's unfamiliar. So I think most people have a fair amount of knowledge about things like that. In the case of history and certain scientific facts, I don't think people make the distinction between the rumored content and the stuff they've processed. I don't think that distinction is commonly made. I think most people, with regard to most common knowledge, in quotes, facts about history, is such that with fairly little intellectual work, maybe, a couple of minutes, they could elevate it to knowledge or things that they have a high probability of. But that they haven't done that work. And so you could say it's only at the level of stuff they've heard. But most people don't actually use that content much. So it's a little bit indeterminate. And I think people are somewhat sensitive to the issue of, am I relying on this? And when they are, do start to get a bit more critical of it. So I'm trying to bring that out more as an explicit method. So that's how I think about it.
So what I'm asking is, are you saying, wake up, objectivists, you're not keeping metadata, you're in a walking zombie state?
Yeah, but not about everything. And I'm saying be attuned to what you're doing what about.
Explain that a little.
Be attuned to the fact that you don't know economics, let's say to somebody. You've heard Yaron give a lecture and it sounded plausible. It fits with some other stuff you know, but you haven't thought about it. You can see that there are some errors in Krugman's reasoning on moral issues that you do know more about, but these particular things about exactly what would happen if this law was passed, or exactly how onerous Sarbanes-Oxley was, or whatever it is, isn't something you know. You've heard it, you have maybe some reason to think it's true, maybe even good reason if you thought, but you just haven't done the work to think about how much you know it. Some of you have, but many of you haven't. That not everything you know is in that. Not everything you think you know, or that you say, or that you believe is in that state. And again, which things are in which state is going to be different for different people. Some of them are going to be less than that, and some of them are going to be a lot more. And you need to pay attention to which is which. I don't think there's enough attention. But this is not just objectivists, you fool. This is the whole world. I don't think pays enough attention to which is which. We ought to be better at it than most people. I don't think we're enough better at it than most people. That is, as a subculture or subcommunity. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to urge us to be more.
That's good.
So this is going back to what Brian was saying earlier, and I think you just touched on it at the just a moment ago. So you were saying how when you're going to use your knowledge, if it's something that's possible, then naturally most people will then do research. If it's going to impact, so if something, maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth. if
I'm
you're
here
not
to take them out if you do.
yeah. So if something is unsure in your mind, but you haven't done the research before, then when you're actually going to act on it, then most people would then actually do research when it came to actually acting on knowledge that they or some things that they didn't really know much about.
Well, I want to distinguish between work and research. What I'm primarily talking about is the work of thinking the thing through. That might involve research, by which I mean, reading stuff you haven't read before. But it might not. It might just involve reflection on it. Now, what I think is whenever you use a premise, or whenever you infer something from it, if you're at all a sensitive, thoughtful thinker, and we all are to some extent, we've learned how to think when we were little kids. Some people are really, there's degrees here, and there are some evil people who are constantly evading. But, barring the worst people, if you're at all sensitive to your thinking at all and care about getting things right and such, when you notice yourself resting your case for something on a certain belief, that puts a little bit of pressure on that belief. Just like when you build another floor on top of a building, that puts some pressure on the building. And if you value the things that are involved in what you're doing and your decision, you care about being right, you care about the consequences of the actions you're taking based on a belief, you get a feeling of, geez, am I sure of this? I better be sure if I'm going to do that. I mean, think about somebody making a decision to marry somebody or to start a business. Or there are certain beliefs in, am I sure this is a good relationship? I had this doubt. Am I sure e-cigarettes are going to continue to boom? Or whatever it might be, that is the belief that's motivating your thinking. Should I sign this lease? There are regulations that might prevent me from opening this business. I can't tell when. I think I'll be able to open it in time, not to lose money on signing this lease, but how sure can I be of that? Am I certain of it? I better figure that out before I invest $1 million in this property. I think people have that sense of, am I on shaky ground here or am I on firm ground? I think it's a natural, normal part of cognition. What I'm trying to do with these lectures and with the whole course of thinking that's given rise to them is to help us become more purposeful and self-conscious in that process. So I think we do have a feeling of, am I sure this is true? How can I be sure when we notice that we're relying on a piece of putative knowledge? I want to help us to heighten that and then to know better what to do when that question occurs to us. I think what people normally do, in fact, is revert to their feelings of how confident they are in the conclusion, how confident they feel in the conclusion. And there's something right about that, because those cognitive emotions, we might call them, are our primitive subconscious form of holding the metadata that I'm encouraging us to hold. But we can do better than that. We can make explicit the questions and the answers to them that go behind that confidence. Where did I learn this? What are my reasons for thinking of it? And how good are those reasons? And we can automatize the habits of making quick glances to that metadata in our thinking and noticing whether we have it and whether we don't, and upgrading or downgrading the premises accordingly. If we do that, we'll be in control over our thinking, and we'll be able to know more things and be more certain, or rather be certain, of things where the knowledge is difficult and we couldn't rationally be certain otherwise.
So my question is the distinction, is there a sharp line between possible and probable? Or is it a continuum? And if there's a sharp line, what makes the line?
So I think there is a sharp line between regarding something as possible and regarding it as probable. And likewise between regarding it as arbitrary and regarding it as possible. And between regarding it as probable and regarding it as certain. These are different epistemic statuses you classify things as that have sharp distinctions, I think, in the way you deal with them in your thinking and action. So then the next question is, what is the basis? What makes it reasonable to classify them as one way versus the other? And there I don't think the line is quite as sharp. I think the phenomena is continuous, and one has to impose discrete boundaries on it. And there might be situations where it's reasonable to put the cutoff at a somewhat different point. So it's similar to, in the law, there's it's discrete whether one is treated as of age or not for a given purpose. But, and there are things in reality that justify the distinction between who's of age and who isn't. But the things in reality that justify it aren't discrete, like, at 11:59 on the day before the birthday, the person just couldn't vote, and then at 12 o'clock, suddenly they've acquired all the faculties that makes them a sound deliberator and a part of the body politic. That's ridiculous. Obviously, the facts about people that make it the sense that they ought to be allowed to vote fade in over time, but it's necessary to draw a hard distinction somewhere in the law with regard to who we allow to vote and who we don't. And there's just some optionality about where within a range it's drawn. I think it's the same way with evidence. There's mounting evidence for things. There's situations where it wouldn't be irrational for somebody to regard something as possible, but it's just below where I'd regard it as possible, or likewise with the transition from possible to probable, or probable to certain. But I think there is a kind of range in which after which it stops being reasonable. And the mental sets that you have with regard to them are very distinct. Now, with regard to how you actually tell, what makes it, one needs to think about the many different kinds of fields in which these judgments are made and what the standards of evidence are there. And I don't think there's very much one could say at an abstract level encompassing all of knowledge for that.
So one of the cases that I was thinking of, and I'm feeling a little confused on this, is I might be planning to cross the street. I know it is very unlikely that a car will be coming from the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. But the consequences would be catastrophic if I were to ignore that. So I will act the same as if it were probable, even though I know that it is not probable.
I don't think that's exactly what's happening in these cases. I mean, it's true that you're taking the same actions you would take if you thought it was probable, or really even if you regarded it as a possibility. But I don't think that's how you're actually regarding it. I don't think in most cases like this, when you look both ways before you cross the street, it's because you think it's probable or possible that a car is coming, say if it's a night where there's very little traffic. I think what's happening is you're executing a kind of routine or procedure, a habit that you've adopted. And you're not executing that habit because of something that you think about the particular situation you're in, other than that it's a situation of crossing a street. It's a habit that you, in general, enact when you cross streets. And the reason for enacting it in general is because it is a procedure that alerts you to any evidence of danger that there might be when crossing a street. That's what makes it a good habit. And then on the basis of what you're alerted to, you will then come to regard it as possible, probable, or certain that there's a specific threat at a specific time. It's similar to medical testing. When you go to the doctor and they look you over and look for all sorts of things, I don't think it's because it's possible that I don't think it's because you or the doctor considers it to be possible that you have each of the many maladies that tests are run for in a battery of tests. Rather, I think it's because it's possible that at some point in your life you'll get some disease. Indeed, that's probable. And so we enact a policy of scanning or screening for diseases in a general way, having a battery of tests for common diseases that we administer regularly so that should you have any disease, it will come to evidence of it will come to the doctor's attention. And then at that point, once some evidence of some specific disease comes to the doctor's attention, it becomes possible that or probable that in the doctor's mind or your mind that you have the disease. And at that point, specific further tests are taken or specific precautionary measures. That's the kind of thing that I think is going on in the street crossing case, too. And if you deliberate about whether or not to follow the habit on a particular occasion, I think really what's happening is you have it as a general rule, I do this when I cross streets, and you're considering whether it's worth making an exception to the general rule because of some special case about this street.
Follow up Andrew's question, there's two aspects which he touched on: probability and then severity. And when the consequences are so severe, then however unlikely it is, if it doesn't take much effort to check, it's worth doing, simply because the consequences would be so, as he said, dire if in fact the car was coming down the street the wrong way. So just, it's certainly worth doing out of a habit, because it takes very little effort, and you're avoiding a catastrophe if the unlikely were to occur.
I think that's right. So are we talking about, I think I misunderstood the case. So you're talking about the case where you're looking for a car that's coming the wrong way up the street.
Yes.
I see. Okay,
Yes,
that...
in fact, I went through exactly that calculation this morning. I was walking across a street in New York, and the street was clearly marked one way. It was also marked closed. There were some large buses in the way, and I thought, all of these things say there's not going to be any car coming. Will I still look? And I said, absolutely.
But there will be a bike coming.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, I didn't even
That's
think of
exactly
that.
right.
I was thinking, yeah, but buses might not obey their own rules. And so, yes, there could be a bus. In any case, I did go, the calculation was exactly as Evan said, unlikely but dire. So, well worth the expense of checking.
So
This is a rare case.
Well, it's not a rare case that special provisions are made in case of dire contingencies. There are whole fields that do nothing but that. I mean, Evan, you're in risk management, right? There are plenty of businesses, whole careers that are organized around these kinds of high risk, low probability situations. And medicine certainly is among the things that it looks for. Is not among the things that are tested for are not only the things that are most common, but the things that would be most bad if they happened. So I do think it's an important question. I wanted to distinguish two elements. One is that you treat things that are especially bad separately. What the value stakes are for things, and two, not everything that one institutes a policy of checking for, I think, counts in the epistemological sense as a possibility on each occasion that one checks for it. If you can make one decision at one time to implement a policy of doing something lightweight throughout your life every time the kind of occasion comes up, then the rationale for doing that is that if you do that thing across the course of your life, there's a possibility that it will detect this problem. I don't think that means that there's a separate possibility and a separate decision point each time. I think the decision made each time is whether to adhere to a policy, which policy is grounded in the possibility of the thing across the life. Now, with respect to severity, I think once something does raise to the level of possibility, then its severity has a lot to do with how much you invest in taking the precautions for it that you have to take because it's a possibility. Once it's raised to the level of a possibility, you have to keep the alternative in which it occurs live in your thinking. How much provision will you make in your thinking and acting for the alternative that it might occur? Well, that depends on how likely it is, where on the realm of possible probable to certain it is, but also how big a deal will it be if it does happen. So you get in the differential diagnosis in medicine, the various possibilities. If one of them is going to kill the guy in 15 minutes, even if it's not the most probable one, that one should be checked for first. And I think likewise in other kinds of fields.
So let me just ask you then, if I'm walking down a road that runs along, and there's a train track that runs along the road, I'm not going to take any special precaution to ensure my safety in case a train happens to jump the track and hit me, because the likelihood of that happening is so small as to, is that even, I suppose it's possible, but the likelihood is so small that I'm not going to give that a second thought. Whereas I agree with the example of the one-way street which I see every day in my life walking around the city, where, okay, it's pretty rare that I find a car going the wrong way down a one-way street. But cyclists, certainly, I see them going every which way all the time. And in fact, I've had close encounters where I stepped out into a street and I was aware that it was a one-way street and there were no cars coming that way. And the next thing you know, whoosh, there goes a bike right by me. And if I had moved a little differently, I would have been hit by the cyclist. Do you see a distinction between those two examples?
I think so, but the way I think of it is a little different. I don't think of it as a separate epistemological issue every street that you encounter afresh and then rely on your past knowledge of streets. Should I look both ways? I think rather, and likewise in with the train tracks, I think rather you have good reason to develop a habit, a kind of standard procedure you don't even think about as you're doing, which would make you alert to any evidence should it arise. So I don't treat it every time I cross the street as a possibility that I'll get run over, but rather I have instituted a habit of doing this, and because I know that I have that habit, I know that if there was in any situation where that evidence would be near to hand, it would come to my attention. And I think that that's the way to think of it. And I think likewise with trains, you would have automatized an alertness to your surroundings around trains, but not a specific, maybe it'll jump the track, maybe it won't, maybe, I think just a general alertness to...
Well, but there's train tracks there.
Yes,
there's some train tracks there. But I'm not going to then go, oh, you know what, I think I'm going to walk on the other side of the street because that train might jump the tracks and hit me.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think you alluded to it there. I think the point that's hasn't been made explicit about the crossing the street example is the value of the automatization, right? Automatizing, look left and right and left again, right, before you cross a street. There's a real value to just having that be something that you do and cultivating that habit precisely so you're not faced with, even if it's a split second of deliberation and weighing evidence every time you encounter a street, and debating, well, is this the kind of street that there's likely to be a car on at this hour of the day? And, I'll just do this. And then, you've answered the question and you can go across it.
Yeah, part of it is, I think, the whole apparatus of how we carve up what to do in the face of different amounts of evidence for something has a lot to do with what our cognitive capacities are, how much ability we have to consider how many different alternatives on how many occasions and so forth. And it's because of that I draw this distinction. Once one regards something as possible, it becomes a mental project that one has over time to track the evidence for it. And it's in cases where that kind of thing is worth doing that the whole set of possible, probable, certain, where that whole issue arises. If it's something that you see it or you don't, that is, you see a car or you don't see a car if you're looking in the right way, I don't think that whole continuum arises. What you have to do, though, is cultivate in yourself a set of habits so that evidence pertinent to the things in your life will come to your attention. And on a very low scale, the looking both ways before you cross the street is a kind of protocol to implement in your life, which will make it the case that evidence will come to your attention. And if you see the car, it'll be certain that there's a car there, unless there's some weird situation where it's late at night and you can't tell if it's a car. Then it would be possible that there is a car, or is that light just a firefly, and you could, over the course of 30 seconds, engage in a little, theoretical reasoning about what's happening. But that's an unusual case. Harry?
An objection that occurs to me to the automatization argument, and I think there's a different argument that applies here. The objection is if it's kind of a technical, practical problem, because if you could automatize, look left then right, unless it's a one-way street,
mm-hmm.
then that would just raise the question again, is that a good thing to automatize? And I think what maybe we're neglecting here is you're not just looking. I mean, it's always good to know where you're going and not to have blinders on to your left side. So generally, as you're out walking, particularly in an environment where things are moving, you want to be aware all around you, as opposed to, for instance, looking under the bed when you go to bed to see if some assassin is hiding under there, which would be arbitrary.
So I agree with that, but I think there's a specific reason for the left, right, left.
Yep.
And it came up when I was going to
I'm not questioning that at all.
Okay.
I'm just saying that's not the...
Right. It's part of the more general, it's a specification of the more general be aware of your surroundings protocol. But there's a particular reason for implementing the left, right, left protocol having to do with what side of the street people drive on. And it's different if you're in England. But now you say, what about the more complicated protocol of left, right, left, unless you notice it's a one-way street? Well, there I think there are two questions. One, could someone psychologically implement it? Two, how much time would it save given how common one-way streets are, and that is a matter of apart in where you live. But second, I think if you're considering making that your policy, left, right, left, except on one-way streets where you only look one way, then you need to consider now, as you're thinking of training yourself to be that kind of looker, the possibility that at some time in your life, there will be somebody coming the wrong way up the one-way street. And I think that is possible.
Yes.
It might not be possible if you specify it down to one occasion. It's not a distinct possibility that at 3:42 p.m. on January the 30th, whatever. But if you adopt the policy of never looking the wrong way up one-way streets, I think it's not only a possibility, but a probability that at some point a bike or something will be coming.
Yeah. Okay. Could you tie this now back to your sniff test and automating that, in that when you do that, it's not because you are being skeptical and saying, well, how do I know every time I have a thought that it's wrong? But like with the car, it's that a good procedure to have for, because you know you're not omniscient, and over your life there will be conclusions you've reached that may be in error and that you need to check more deeply, or even if you're not in error, you might make new integrations so that to go back to the higher level of the sniff test, I think what we're discussing about why it's valuable to look left, right, left has implications for why it's good to automate that. I think
that's right. They're the same type of thing. The sniff test is a mental habit or protocol that's always running, and it is not holding each belief in suspicion. And that's something I want to... It's a friendly question. It's not interrogating each of your beliefs. It's just, friendly as it passes through your mind. How do I know this? Not how do I know this, you scum bastard who all the time is engaging in arbitrary. Just how do I know? I heard it from Joe, and it's just that. And am I sure of this? And it's because it's a value. You see, here it's not as with the left, right, left. In case of a specific possibility, there might be a car coming, which is the main thing that's relevant there. But here it's because it's valuable and important in your thinking to have an awareness of the pedigree and status of your data. You need that information for all kinds of things in your thinking. And so it's important to develop a habit of being alert to it. It's more like why it's good to cultivate a general awareness of your surroundings, that, as Harry was talking about, rather than the specific left, right, left, which is in case of a particular scenario that's particularly relevant to streets in countries where we drive on the right-hand side.
So the psychological concept of intolerance of uncertainty deals with the fact that in many contexts, especially ones where there are important values and action implications at stake, not knowing is a source of great emotional distress. It causes pointless rumination, tempts us to rush to conclusions just so we can relieve the stress of not knowing, etc. Is this a healthy and unavoidable psychological tension that we just need to be cognizant of so we can do our best to stay objective in spite of it, just as we do with confirmation biases? Or is there some mistaken premise behind it, at least in some cases, e.g. the premise that I need to be omniscient or some version of wishing makes it so?
I think in some cases the one and in some cases the other. There's a general nervousness people have from an awareness of the fact that they don't know everything and that everything can have some impact on their lives. And one just has to accept that. There's an infinity of things to know and you can't know them all and you have to prioritize what. And if that gives you any angst or anxiety, then that's a psychoepistemological issue one needs to work on. However, there are types of mistakes one could make, I think, and techniques one can employ that if one does the wrong thing, one will end up with a lot of this kind of stress and worry, and there are methods for getting rid of it. One of these is there's always something that with a little bit of work, this is what I think is true, there's, with regard to every question you have, there's always something that with only a small amount of work you can reach certainty about. That might just be that I don't know, or that it doesn't matter, or that it might be its epistemic status, that this is probable. It might be less than its epistemic status. It might be that this is something that I haven't thought about but don't need to, and so I don't know its epistemic status, but it goes to me in the category of unprocessed knowledge, and that's fine. The more work you put in, the more things you could have certainty about, but you could have certainty about these meta-level claims about it, claims about how much it matters, about how sure you are of it, about what you need to do to be more sure of it. And what I would encourage someone to do who's in the grips of that intolerance for uncertainty in a particular issue is to focus on the things they can be certain about it, achieve certainty about some things about it. And then if they find themselves anxious about it, to remind themselves of those things and to remind themselves in particular about the ones that govern how they should proceed with it. So, for example, here's a situation. You've applied for a number of different positions around the country for graduate school or a fellowship, and many of us, you're in this position now, I think, and many of us have been in it at different times, and you don't know if you'll get any of them, and if you do, you don't know which one you'll get. And that's a stressful kind of situation to be in, and you can't know. You could spend your whole life researching something or other that would give you slightly more information on just how likely you are to get into this place. But there's no more work you can do on it. You've already sent in the applications. Knowing that I'm 63.2% more likely to go to New York than California is not going to help if you already know that you're somewhat more likely to go to New York than California. So you work out, probably it's New York, but it's not very much more probable than the other alternatives. Here's what I can do given my present state of knowledge. Here's when I can expect to learn more. And you work out things like this, a kind of plan for proceeding and for making the decisions that you can be certain of. And then when you feel your anxiety about the uncertainty, some of it is just natural and unavoidable, but you remind yourself of those things that you can be certain of. You check that you are certain of those. You say, is this anxiety giving me a clue that there's some more thinking I need to do about one of these things that I'm not sure of? Or is this just because it sucks to not know where you're going to be next year and I just have to put up with a certain amount of that until this date when I figured out I'll be able to know more? And I think that should make one feel better. If it doesn't make one feel better, at least enough better to go on with life, then I think it's a psychotherapeutic problem rather than an epistemic problem. But in those kinds of acute situations where there's some sort of Damocles hanging over your head and you need to find out about it, it's, I think, not even a psychotherapeutic problem. It just sucks to have a big open question hanging over you.